Bizarre Reality Media. The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Bizarre Society? Welcome to the expanse of deep conversational exploration into the fringes of social norms. I'm the one they call Shane, aka the original Shane Squatch, and today for you guys, I have the always insightful Seth Vandebrooke from Project Eleazar, yet again for another installment of the Illuminated Bible series. This time around, we'll embark on a fascinating journey into the far reaches of the Garden of Eden, exploring its physical and spiritual dimensions, the mysteries surrounding its location, and its enduring impact on theology and prophecy, all while digging into rich symbolism and profound significance of Eden as depicted in biblical texts. Join Seth and I as we unravel the layers of Eden's narrative, offering fresh perspective and insights that may challenge conventional understanding. But before we get into this fascinating conversation, I have a very exciting piece of news. 4 years ago, we started with a simple question: what is really going on in this reality? Today, Inquiries of Our Reality hits the 4-year mark, and that question has only grown deeper. From the shadows of cryptozoology to the hidden mechanisms of mind control and systematic conspiracy, we've spent 48 months peeling back the layers of the official story. Whether you're dissecting leaked documents or the high-level tools of psychological influence, we've made it our mission to see through the static. To the guests who have brought their expertise, to the collaborators who have kept the gears turning, and most importantly, to the listeners who aren't afraid to look into the dark, thank you. We aren't just documenting the bizarre, we're mapping it. Here's to another year of seeking the truth, no matter how bizarre it gets. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and of course, always stay bizarre. Join me for the next chapter with Season 5, starting now. And with all your support, I'm excited to see what the next year will bring. And again, from me and from Inquiries of Our Reality, thank you.
Ooh, yeah!
And moving on, if anybody might possibly be interested in catching the next live episode of Bizarre Inquiries, that'll be happening this week on Thursday, April 2nd at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over in the usual place, the Bizarre Reality Media YouTube channel. And if anybody has anything that they would like to submit for that, be it a question, clip, or article, you guys can send it to us before then. But if not, of course, we will pass it along to the next episode. And if anyone is interested in possibly being a guest on the show, sharing your bizarre encounter or experience, or contacting me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys could call or text me on the Bizarre Reality Media hotline, and that number is 313-364-1551, and you guys can call or text that 24/7. And for any professional inquiries, you guys can email me at bizarrerealitymedia@outlook.com. And if you guys happen to miss any of that, it is all available down in that show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome back to the show, quickly becoming one of the most return guests for the Illuminated Bible series. Please welcome back Seth Vandebrooke from Project Eleazar. How's it going today, man?
It's going really well. Life is good. Can't complain.
Hey, there you go, man. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. I always get really excited for these because we end up getting into a bunch of different side conversations as we go throughout these, but I never know quite what you're going to end up throwing at me each individual time we end up going into these episodes, so that ends up making it a little bit more fun because usually I don't know the topic till the day of. So I guess without further ado, before I get too derailed off of something else, man, why don't you let everybody know what we're getting into today for the series?
So today we're going to be talking about Eden and the Garden of Eden. A lot of people view it as mythical. I do not. The Bible has a lot more to say about it than I think people know. And scholars have even more to say about it. So I think it'll be really fun to dive into this, see a lot of the symbolism and narrative that's wrapped up around Eden, and we'll tackle some of the common questions of, where do we think it was? What language were they maybe speaking when they were in the Garden of Eden? What did things look like? What was it? Was it just a garden? Was it a realm? What was it? Was it supernatural? Was it natural? So we'll be getting into all those little fun nitty gritty questions.
Well, perfect. So I guess before we start getting really rolling on this one, is there anything at all from the last couple of series that you feel like you might need to bring into context before we start rolling into this series?
Not too much. I think there is a little bit of a relationship between the first one that we did, the first episode, and this one. Simply that, before the creation of everything, there was this celebration with angels, right? There was this supernatural celestial celebration, if you will. And that will only slightly tie into this, but mostly just because there is some angelic stuff going on. And so keeping that context in the back of your head that, these spiritual beings were there first and were celebrating and were witnessing. We talked about the creation of Eden as a place where God would dwell. So that's connected. So perhaps if you're looking for that context, you can go back and listen to that first episode.
And just to throw this one in here, because I don't know if I had mentioned it on the last couple of episodes, but once we get rolling on this a little bit, once we get to about, I'd say like 20 episodes roughly or so, the intention is to be able to take all these and put them onto their own feed. So if you're somebody that's been listening since the beginning, or maybe you're popping in at this point once it's on the other feed, it'll be a little bit easier for you guys to be able to listen to all of these in context. But as far as this goes for inquiries, what I'm going to try to do until we get to a point where we have all these things in order, I'm going to try to put a list underneath of all the Illuminated Bible series numbers so that if anybody wants to check back on one of the previous episodes while they're in the inquiries feed, they'll have all the episode numbers in context, because I don't remember what episode number that was offhand, but I want to make sure that we throw that out there for the listeners in case they want to go back and hear it. So
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome.
So I guess hopping into this one, man, where exactly would you like to start at?
So Eden, there are so many things that are debated on this, so I think it makes it a fun discussion, because some things are set in stone and a lot are not. But a pretty basic place to start is what are the different terms that are used to refer to this place? Eden is referred to as a place, at least, because it's used in other ways as well, and in three different ways. So you have the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, and the Garden of the Lord. Now, when it says the Lord, and this is normal for a lot of English translations, oftentimes when you see in all caps, Lord, Lord, that's normally actually the word Yahweh in the original Hebrew. And they decided, hey, we're just going to do all caps Lord. And it normally says that in the front of your Bible or whatever. It will say, hey, this is what this means. If it's lowercase, it means this. If it's this, it's that. So they'll explain those kind of rules of how they're formatting stuff. But in these verses, it's commonly translated Garden of the Lord or Garden of God. And when it says Garden of God, it's the word Elohim. When it says Lord, it's Yahweh. Now this is
not to throw everything off of tracks too much. I apologize for that, but I already have a quick question to throw in here. So just as far as like translations go, when you hear Yahweh, a lot of people assume that that's like the name of God himself. So as far as like the translation goes, just out of curiosity, because you're a little bit more familiar with this than I am, and I'm sure a lot of other people are, is Yahweh strictly translated the word Lord, or is it specifically a name when it comes to Hebrew? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's an important question. So Yahweh is not the word for Lord. That is different. And some people do make that mistake in thinking that that's what that is. So Yahweh doesn't mean Lord. What happened was there's a long-standing tradition in Jewish tradition, which was to not say the name of Yahweh, because there was this healthy respect and this fear of you don't want to speak his name. Why? Because in Exodus 20, when they were given the law not to use his name in vain, they were like, the last thing I want to do is break one of the 10 commandments by misusing his name. And I mean, you read the Old Testament, like when there was mishandling of the holiness of God, like people were struck dead. It was a serious issue. And so there's a long-standing tradition of taking it very seriously, and they would never even speak his name. Now, there was no rule, there's no law saying you're not allowed to speak my name. But that's what they kind of turned it into to be safe. More
Yeah,
or
I'd rather
less,
be
right?
safe than sorry, I guess, right?
Yeah, seriously, right? Rather be safe than dead. So now, of course, so then why do we say it so freely now? Well, because the game has changed in that sense. One, it was never really a rule in the first place, but secondly, there really is this grace and this opening by Jesus Christ, right? So we now have total freedom to be able to say that name. And there's still Jews today that will say, that are Messianic, that will say, I still don't feel right like saying it, so they choose not to, and that's totally fine. But yeah, so that's what's going on there. So Yahweh would be the closest thing that we have to his actual name. The name of God is actually a complex, abstract idea that's more than just sound. And so that's its own, that could be its own episode. That's a whole thing.
I've always kind of took it as one of those things where it's like just the simplified concept of like God is something that's so beyond human thought that how could it simply be like, yep, here's my name. Like the whole concept of giving it a name is strictly like a human concept. So I feel like it's kind of one of those things that it's like, I'm beyond a name, but if you need to call me something, like call me this, I guess.
Yeah, because and I will say, I think that names, there is a kind of divine context there, but though that name, if you will, Yahweh, means just existing one. And this is like when, God tells Moses, right? He says, I am that I am. And so instead, when he asks like, well, who are you? What's your name? He doesn't give a name. He says, I am that I am. And that's what Yahweh means. It means I am, or existing one. Existing, think of it as eternal. Like it's the idea of existing, period, right? No beginning, no end, the ever existing one, or the everlasting one. You can say it all those different ways, but it's getting to the same concept. It's like when we talked about like infinity, right? And something that's infinite and something that's finite, and how all of that works. Like this is speaking to the infinite nature of God himself. And so in a sense, the point of this name is to say that he's beyond such things, which is kind of cool.
It's almost in a more simplified context. It's almost in a weird way, like when you have one of those teachers back in school that had like a really, really long, hard to pronounce name, and the teacher just says, call me Mr. P or something like that, for example. It's almost kind of something like that, I assume.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And it's used sometimes in conjunction with one another. So we have in this first verse, so those three terms, right? We mentioned like Garden of Eden, Garden of God, Garden of the Lord, or Garden of Yahweh. Those three terms, Yahweh, Elohim, and Eden, all show up in the very first verse where we see the Garden of Eden. So the first time we ever see it is Genesis 2:8. And this is where it lays down, what's going on in the narrative, which we'll get to in a second. But in that passage, all those three terms show up next to each other. And what we see throughout that whole chapter is when God shows up, he's referred to as Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Elohim. So he's putting both terms together, because for anyone who doesn't know, Elohim isn't just a name of God. It's more of an ontological word, meaning referring to the what the thing is as opposed to what the thing does. So Elohim is this term that's used for spiritual beings in general. And the idea is that there are many spiritual beings, right? Angels and demons, but there's only one Yahweh. So he's an Elohim, but there's no Elohim like Yahweh. So he's unique. He's in his own category, but he's a spiritual being. So you can very easily just refer to it as like spiritual being, right? So it's that kind of broad stroke. And so when it says Elohim, it's being explicit that it's like not just any Elohim. This is Yahweh Elohim. This is the existing one. This is the one that created everything in the last chapter, right? So it's being explicit. And in a pretty cool way. There's some neat complexities and nuance to how that works. But it's
almost kind of like the concept with like angel versus like archangel. It's like that additional title in the beginning to show like mastery over like the concept as a whole in a weird way. So you can almost kind of relate it the same way categorically about how these names would be kind of like defined, right?
Yeah, that's not a bad way to do it, right? Where it's further clarification, or a modification of that word. Sometimes when the word Elohim is used, it's more of a it will use like an article to make it clear that it's specifically referring to him, and so it's still contextual. But when it says like Ha Elohim, it's specifically saying the Elohim, which is always implying that that's God himself. But this is going even a step further to specifically use, if you will, his name when referring to to him as the person who is doing each of these things, making this garden, planting it, creating this relationship with Adam as he makes him, and then spends time with him in the garden and all those things. So it's cool. There's almost an intimacy to it and a reverence, or kind of like majesty, if you will, that's related to using both of these words in conjunction with each other, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad for the verification, because it's one of those things that, like we've talked about a bunch of times on the show, you hear these terms tossed around, but I don't feel like a lot of people have like full clarification of these things. So as these things pop up, I'm glad that we're able to kind of like address them, because you don't think about them offhand, but as soon as they come up in conversation, you're like, yeah, that's one of those things.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what we're seeing here, and that's what we're dealing with. It introduces the Garden of Eden with it being made by specifically Yahweh Elohim, right? And so all three of those terms show up in that first verse, right? And then those three different words are what end up being associated with the word gan, which is for garden, in each of the verses that refer back to the Garden of Eden in each of those different ways. So that's kind of laying the groundwork. Those are the three terms. They're all based on that first time that we see it. So what we see in this passage is interesting, because chapter 2 opens up honestly by finishing chapter 1. And, chapters and verses, they were added way later. The original text didn't have that, right? So really what we're seeing at the beginning here is it's wrapping up. It's really the end of the first creation narrative, and then we're popping into the second one. What do I mean when I say that? Well, the first creation narrative is more or less Genesis 1. It's really Genesis 1 through these first couple of verses of Genesis 2. And that's just there was nothing, then God did this, he said this, he made that. It's going through and describing the creation order. Now what it does is it kind of backs up, zooms out, and then zooms back in, and is like, all right, now let's tell the story from a much more intimate perspective, not from this like big bird's eye view, but from this intimate perspective about God who was hovering over the waters in chapter 1 and then speaking. If you ever ask the question, okay, so I know he was hovering over the waters in the beginning, but then where was he? Like, what was he doing, throughout the process? Well, chapter 2, it zooms in. And so once he's created the land, he's got all this stuff going on. When he goes to start making the creatures and the vegetation and all this stuff, it turns out that he's in Eden. He's in this specific area of the planet, which is very interesting if you ask me. Like, why he's beyond form, he's beyond limit. Like, why choose to even have locality in that moment in the first place? Like, so many questions I feel like pop up there. But the
Isn't
point
that
is
part of the debate
is
like the physicality of it possibly in the first place? Because not to say that this is fully related to it, but I mean, you hear like the references of, like, for example, like the garments and things that were worn in the Garden of Eden, and you hear about, I think we mentioned this, we're talking about this, where they're made out of like almost like a light or like some other like type of like energy force. So it almost kind of makes you wonder, with like certain context of that, is it possible that like Eden itself may not have been like a physical place in the context that like we know as physical, but more of this like I don't want to say like a heavenly place, but like wherever this like other kind of like realm kind of exists, like this in-between layer between like the heavens and like earth as we know it.
Well, it is kind of both. And so that's part of what I wanted to get to here, is that Eden, to summarize, Eden is not just a garden. It's not just a couple of plants. What made the Garden of Eden, as opposed to just a garden, what made it paradise was the presence of God. And so what we see is, and lots of scholars describe it this way, Eden was this overlap, like a Venn diagram. It was this overlapping of worlds. It was a realm where the divinity of God met the nature of his creation. And so you have this beautiful paradise, which starts out actually not a beautiful paradise. And we'll get into that in a second here. Just like in chapter 1, where we see everything started out with, tohu vavohu, it was waste wilderness, or it was formless and void, depending on how you translate it. And then he creates order and all this beauty. Similarly, we see it starts out with what is somewhat wasted. It doesn't have the vegetation yet. It doesn't have the creatures yet. So it starts out with this kind of blank slate. And then he brings that beauty in. But when we see that happen, he not only does stuff, he doesn't just like do stuff and leave, but he doesn't do it from a distance. He like shows up in Eden on earth and then makes these beautiful things, and then he stays there. It's the dwelling place of God with humanity on earth. And that's what connects a little bit to that previous episode that we did on that pattern of God creating a place for him to commune with humanity and the angels celebrating. And then, Garden of Eden goes south. So then he says, hey, let's make a temple. They make a temple, and that's where he meets, and then their celebration. Temple gets destroyed. Jesus comes in and says, hey, I'm actually the intercessor. Moving forward, you'll have the Holy Spirit within you, and you'll be the temple. And then there's celebration with that too. So that's that pattern that we see. And so this is the first time, right? This is the very beginning. This is, all right, I've got my angelic hosts, but I'm about to make humanity, and this is going to be the place where we hang out. And it's not like I'll meet them here in Eden sometimes. It's like he chooses to live in Eden. This is the place that he makes his home on earth, which, again, like, he just doesn't need to do that. But this is him going out of his way to be with these humans that he loves so dearly. And so there's this intimacy that's there. So in chapter 2, as it opens up, it says in verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts, which is interesting where it means like armies, or just hosts in general, right? But it's a cool word that's used there. And then verse 2, it says, by the seventh day, God completed his work, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day. And this is where the Sabbath comes from, right? So it says, then God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it because he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. And then in verse 4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God, again, that's, Yahweh Elohim, made earth and heaven. So that's our finishing of the last narrative, and then our segue into the next creation narrative in verse 5, where it starts out saying, now no shrub of the field was yet on the earth. And so anyone who's reading linearly is like, what? I thought we already got through the making of all those things. But it's backing up. This is normal for ancient literature, right? So it's rewind and then zoom in. So there's no shrub of the field, it says, was yet on the earth. No plant of the field had yet sprouted. So now we know, okay, so we're a couple days backwards now. For the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth. And this is where we get some interesting details, right? And how until the flood, we actually didn't have rain. And it's going to go into detail about how that worked. So God had not yet sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Okay, so this is still pre-humanity. But a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. So there was actually this really thick mist that you just didn't need rain because the humidity was so thick that everything was flourishing. You just constantly would be flourishing You would constantly be causing all of the vegetation to flourish. Now, the vegetation isn't there yet, though, so we're not there yet. But the mist, it's backing up and giving us context. Hey, the mist is actually how everything worked before we had the rain. Which there's actually a lot of cool creation science that talks about evidence for exactly that being the case.
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to the show.
In verse 7, it says, then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground. This is a cool phrase. And while this isn't necessarily strictly about Eden, I think it'd be cool to pause here because it says that the Lord God, again, Yahweh Elohim, formed man. That's the word Adam. That's where we get the name Adam, of dust. And the word dust there, it can be translated like soil. It's specifically like it's dirt that's kind of been broken up or porous. And then it says from the ground, which is the same word Adam again. So it's actually that Adam was formed from the soil of Adam. And this is what's kind of cool because it's showing, God created humanity out of quite literally the dirt. He didn't need to, he could just speak and make it, boom, we exist. But he chose, as he did with a lot of things here, right? Like in chapter 1, it says like the earth was there, it's formless and void, right? But there's waters. When he separates the water, the earth appears, the dirt comes up from underneath, right? And then from the earth, he makes all these things, which is really interesting. It's from the earth that he makes animals. It's from the earth that he makes humanity. And so he pulls up the soil like a gardener, right? Pulls up the soil, but instead of making plants, here he explicitly then breathes life into it. It says, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And there's so much symbolism here because that word for breath in Hebrew is the word ruach, and it has three meanings. It's a triple entendre. It means wind, breath, or spirit. So here he's breathing in spirit. So you have the dirt, he forms it into a man, which is, there's also some cool science too, that a lot of our genetic makeup is actually the same elements of dirt. And, there's so
not to
cool
mention how many different like beliefs there are that creation has come from, like man coming from mud, man coming from clay,
Yes.
man coming from dirt. Like this is a recurring concept you see
Yes.
through like Native
So
American
many
tribes, South American tribes, like no matter where
Yep.
you are in the world, this idea of literally coming from the soil itself.
Yes, because we did. And that's one of those things where it's like that there's that kernel of truth and all those different stories that everything's pointing back to like there really was something to this. I don't know if you've seen, but it's really cool if you look into like Chinese characters and how when you look at the symbol for a garden is actually like all the different components are of like people and a snake, right? And plants and all these things. And so it's like the story of Genesis 2 and 3 is like built into the characteristics of the symbol for just the word garden, which is so cool. And there's tons of stuff like that with Chinese symbols. It's really, really neat because it turns out there are all these aspects of the biblical narrative are actually like built into their language, and a lot of them don't even realize that's what's going on. But
there's
so
a
many
whole
cool
really,
things
really
like that,
bizarre
right?
story with like with Jesus supposedly going to like Asia. I don't know if you've actually really like dived into that yourself, but like there's this whole like
heard
different weird like belief structure that they have with like Jesus like saying that he went to like Asia and he learned some of like their ideology and everything, and they have this like grave of Jesus and stuff like that they use as like a tribute to the fact that like he was here at one point. Like I don't know, I find it so fascinating that that's just even more proof that it's so indwelled into their culture that it's like they almost like don't even realize it.
Yeah, there really is a lot. And there are a lot of nations that have stories of like Jesus showing up there after his death and resurrection. I personally lean towards that he didn't, that he ascended when it says he ascended and he just went up.
I think the ones for Asia, if I'm not mistaken, were supposedly like before he like reshowed himself around 30. So like that's where it adds some like, it's kind of fascinating aspects to it.
Yeah, the question, right, is like timeline wise, like of when exactly what would happen, right? Because he was with his disciples the whole time, and they give no credence or mention for any time when he would have been not there. So then it would have to be like before his ministry. So anyways, it gets complicated. It's this whole other thing. But regardless, it goes to show how the stories of Jesus impacted all these nations around the world. And regardless,
it's entrenched into culture and language
himself,
just without even realizing it. Like, I mean, how many references do people make to stuff that's related to the Bible within like just expressions of language, and they may not even realize it. Like it's so ingrained into every aspect of language, no matter what language you speak. Like it's fascinating.
it's like Jordan Peterson says, he's like, this is the book. Like it's the single most influential book in history. And there's good reason for that, right? But it's the single most printed, most copied, right? Before printing was even a thing, it was the most copied book in the world, and always has been. It's just stayed as such, which is really remarkable. And the impact is astronomical. I mean, even before the Bible was what we know the Bible to be today, before the New Testament, there were copies of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, made it out further than people used to think. There are quotes by people like Plato and others that are word for word verbatim, like pulling lines from the Bible. And so it's like, well, how did they know about that? Or what? I thought that was just a Jewish thing, but it's like, actually, like these things made their way around, even before, it became like a what we know as a book today, right? Like a codex, even when it was just scrolls, like it proliferated, it made its way around. It would make sense because a lot of the copies of things in general were pretty much always made in, always is a strong word, but more commonly made in Egypt, right? And so because they just had a lot of papyrus, it was like made sense, right? And so many copies of things would be in Egypt, and a lot of people went to Egypt for the same reason. So you have all these books being made in the same, and scrolls being made in the same places, right? Like Egypt, and then being sent out to more places. They make copies, and those copies make copies, and it spreads out. But that's its own that's its own thing. That could be its own episode easily. So then it goes on to, now that it's mentioned, the creation of humanity with Adam here. Then it says in verse 8, the Lord God, again, Yahweh Elohim, planted a garden. Again, there's this intimacy there. So he himself planted a garden. God, who created the universe, who could just speak and make it happen, chose to, it appears, like quite literally, like take form and just like plant a garden. Like the most manual way possible, it seems, right? So he plants this garden. It says toward the east in Eden, and which gives us some idea that Eden was perhaps a larger locale, and the garden was inside of Eden, because it says the garden was toward the east in Eden. Some people argue that's not the case because other verses will just say Eden referring to it, but I think it's because, moving forward, when you just say Eden, they're just thinking of the Garden of Eden. But it seems as though Eden was this larger area, and we'll get to later more evidence for why that might be the case.
I mean, we see that with a lot of context, just to throw it in with a lot of this like old language that I think we talked about it when we were talking about the dog-headed beings, that everything that's referred to after the specific spot is now India, for example. So everything that's past where we are currently to the east is now Eden kind of a thing. So I'm assuming that it's probably the same with a lot of these maps, that they don't really know where the end extension is. So when they have, here's our map, here's where we think it ends, they just call everything that way, whatever that is.
Well, what's interesting, that brings up this interesting question, right? Because it's towards the east, like from where? like nothing is really a thing yet. So to the east of what? Like, where was he exactly? Is this to the east of where Moses was when he wrote this down, when God was telling him about it? Is it Mount Sinai, or is it to the east of somewhere else? Like, I don't know. It's an interesting, there actually are some, I don't remember what they are, but there are a couple of interesting claims that a couple of scholars make, that it's actually referenced to some kind of other phrase with an interesting meaning, but I don't remember the conclusion.
Just to throw in just like a possible idea that we're talking about, just off of the last thing, we're talking about the whole idea about Hades, and that it was like split. And I don't know if it would kind of work possibly the same way, but this whole idea of like east might just be referring to like a split, almost like how they refer to as Hades, where it's just like, here's the west, here's the east. It's more necessarily like a defined line. It's just kind of referring to like, this is the one side of it, this is the other side of it. So maybe it's kind of the same as, like I was saying with the whole Hades thing, that like, here's the side that's already been worked on, here's the undefined side.
I think it's kind of the same problem, because like east and west is always relative. It's always relative to something. And so the question remains of like, east and west of what? Like, what is that? And is it just God? Is it that like wherever he, plopped down, he was like turned toward the east and was like that away? Like, I don't know. Like, well, what did that look like? I have no idea, but it's kind of fun to think about. But then it says that he placed man whom he had made. So now he's like, okay, now I'm going to put humanity in Eden. So he reaches down into the ground, he makes, Adam, and then he plants this garden, he brings him into this garden. It says, out of the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight, good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So now I've got this introduction to these two important trees. And in general, there's a lot of other verses, and I'll include a somewhat exhaustive list in my article that I always put together with all the notes, podcast notes, right? I'll have in the notes a whole bunch of verses where, Eden pops up and where it's mentioned. And a lot of times when it's mentioned, there are these metaphors that are being used, and it talks a lot about the trees of Eden as being these kind of majestic trees. And then it compares things to the trees of Eden and the strength of trees of Eden, like being like the cedars of Lebanon. There's so much going on there. But then how they end up being destroyed, and like Eden, you were amazing, but then you were destroyed. And it's really cool like imagery that gets used with the Garden of Eden moving forward.
Is this where some of the people get that context for the giant trees from, just out of curiosity? Because I know that there's like different like viewpoints on where people get into like the giant tree theory, but is the whole Garden of Eden aspect where people get, one of the avenues where people get into that theory?
That is one of the ideas, that potentially like beforehand when there was this mist, that trees just got so massive, and I don't know. I don't think that that those huge, the ones that are like mountains, I don't actually think those are trees personally, because a lot of those ones have been like tested. It's like, this is for sure rock. But there are some big trees, like regardless of those things, like,
have you seen the ones in South America where they'll like chop into them and like have like a river starting to flow out of that thing because it's holding so much water?
Yeah, there can be some really big trees that we know for sure exist. So regardless of like whether or not you can have mountain-sized ones, like there are some really huge trees.
I mean, look at the redwoods. I mean, like, I don't know if people have seen those in like real life, but look at like a size comparison of like a grown man, and it looks like an ant standing next to like an oak tree.
People drive cars through those things. It's crazy. Like they've got tunnels underneath the tree. Like, yeah, it's wild. And then you have like the age of certain trees. There's like, have you heard of Methuselah, like the oldest tree that's still alive?
Yeah, isn't it like what they're saying? It's like 2,000 years old or something like that? Or
No, I think it's like 4,000 years old.
4,000 years old.
Yeah, I'd have to double check. I'm pretty sure it was like 4,000 something. It was crazy old. Yeah, go ahead and look it up. Tell me what the age actually is, because it was remarkably old. I'm like, that's insane.
4,850 years old.
Isn't that insane?
In the Great Basin. That's in White Mountains of California. Yeah, wow.
It's a Californian tree. I'm like, that is so wild to have a 4,000 plus year, almost 5,000 year old plant. It's insane. So anyways, it's just fun to think about, like, what were these trees like, you know? And we won't even get into, because that for sure is its own episode, but tree of life, knowledge of good and evil, and all that. There's so much going on there. But today's focus is on Eden. So then it talks about these rivers. It says, now a river flowed out of Eden, river singular. And then he says, and from it, it divided into 4 rivers, right? Or it became 4 rivers. And it was interesting. I should have prepared this, but I'm just thinking of it now. Maybe we can add it in later, but I can add it to my notes. But I've been reading through the Geneva Bible. I don't know if you've heard of that Bible, but it's from like 1560. It's the Bible that like the Puritans used when they came over to America. And it came out before King James. It predates it, and it was like very popular.
Was that the standard before King James?
Yeah, and it was kind of known as like the Bible of the Reformation. Kind of became a tagline for it, or whatever. But because it was around that time. But it was the first full English translation, and it was the first one to have, chapters, and not the first one to have chapters and verses at all, but it was the first full Bible to have chapters and verses in English. All the things that we now know the Bible to be today, like that's where it started in English anyway. That's where they started putting those verse numbers and chapter numbers, and those are the numbers of chapters and verses that have stuck around to today, right? So
trying to make it easy reference, that was the whole intention, I assume.
Huh?
Trying to make it easier to reference, that was the whole intention, I assume, and they were trying to like reform it.
Exactly. They were like, okay, how do we do this? And then then things changed later on. They were like, we can't change the numbers, so we'll just like take this verse out or whatever, because they found out some things were added. But yeah, so Geneva Bible is really cool, and it's also literally a study Bible. Like it's got pictures, like woodcut illustrations in there, and it's got descriptions and study notes and footnotes on the sides. It's really cool. And so just for fun, I've been using it in my personal time in the Word in the morning. And there's actually a cool little woodcut illustration of the Garden of Eden and the rivers, of what they think it looked like and how it made sense. And it was really interesting. They had a little quip in there about like what they thought made sense about the rivers and how they flowed or whatever. And it wasn't too far off from what a lot of people think today, but it was kind of cool to read that and be like, this is so wild. Like they were, they did not have access to a lot of stuff that we have today, right? But here they were going out of their way to really think it through, do some research, and they tried to like draw out what it would look like. They do not have any of the like satellite imagery and stuff we have today, right? So it's not that accurate, but it's, you know, it's a pretty good attempt. But it's cool to see that for a long time, like people have been, and way longer than that, people have been thinking about these rivers. I mean, obviously, ever since it was written, but even just in general, like in the last millennia, how people have been spending time trying to think through, trying to draw it out, trying to figure out what's going on with these rivers. And so these rivers, the reason why there's so many questions around it, why it's so significant, is because if you can know for sure where these rivers are, then you have a really good idea of where Eden was. Now, to kind of spoil it,
not to make like a weird analogy, but or is, you know, the whole thing with it, like the Atlantis mythos is everybody trying to find like the circles, that like geographical structure of the circle. So is the equivalent of this, of trying to find Eden, basically trying to find this like
pretty
split
much
area of like where these rivers are?
Yeah, pretty much, right? And there's all these theories because it mentions 4 rivers, right? Or it's splitting out into 4 rivers. And it mentions Pishon, and it mentions Gihon, and then it mentions the 2 that everybody knows, Tigris and Euphrates. So everyone's like, wait, well, what was Pishon and Gihon? Like, where were those? So the real questions lie with the first 2. And boy, is there a lot you could read on this topic. Like, there are so many ideas out there about these rivers. But if I were to sum up a lot of reading, where people generally land, and there really isn't a conclusion, which is the kind of spoiler here.
Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. And now back to the show.
One of the popular candidates for Pishon, and where it, you know, possibly was, and which river it might be that is today, was the Ganges River. That's what Josephus, the Jewish scholar of the 1st century, he believed it to be the Ganges River. He connected it to that explicitly, and I'll have quotes all these things in the notes. But he saw it as being that river, and there were several others who also thought that it was that. Now, currently, that doesn't really connect fully to where Eden probably was, which seems as though it would be, you know, while there's all this debate of the exact location, more or less, all the debated regions are all somewhere around where modern day Iraq, Iran, and Turkey meet. Somewhere over there, right? There's a pretty good argument for it being ancient Sumer is potentially where, you know, Eden was, or the Garden of Eden. Now, of course, there's still the question of, if Eden was a larger geographical area, then like, how big of a region was Eden? What counted as Eden? You know, and we just don't know. So there's a lot of room for speculation there. But you know, other people would put it further north, towards Armenia, right? What at least is modern Armenia today. I mean, they used to be a lot bigger. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which actually I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's kind of a fun thing that we'll probably want to hit on the end. But
kind of funny that we have constant like control aspects that are always happening, like geopolitically in that region, where we're assuming that possibly Eden could be. And also, just to throw this one in here, the hard part with rivers that I think a lot of people forget is that over time rivers do change. Like the Nile itself, there's been like times when that's changed itself. There's people that believe that the Nile itself almost went up completely to the pyramids, like basically like the front of like the pyramids. So, you know, some of these rivers that they may have talked about that back then, which may have been these like huge giant rivers, it's possible that they may not even exist at all anymore, especially considering how like the regions of the desert can change so quickly. And if there was droughts, anything like that, river start to flow different directions. So, you know, we may be looking for something that may not even necessarily exist anymore. Like not Eden itself, but like the rivers that we're trying to use as clues.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of confusion that can come with these. Like you said, I mean, once we hit the flood, like everything's changed so much. It's like, who knows how similar or how different it is from the way it used to be, right? How are we for sure confident that Euphrates and Tigris are the same that they were before the flood, right? Well, we don't really know. I mean, like there's a good chance it's the same, but like it could have changed a little bit, and we don't know what that looked like.
Or I mean, even if they are the same rivers, they may have changed paths still, which is the even harder thing to try to interpret. Is that they may have made a certain point at one point, but maybe with flooding and different things that have happened, now they split off into two different directions. And this point that we may know is a clue in these two rivers. The paths of them have changed over time.
Well, and one of the interesting things is that Gahan, a lot of people seem to think that it might be the Nile, and that's an interesting one, because if you guys have no idea like what we're talking about, like, so ancient Sumer and all those things, that, again, like this would be in like Iraq, right? And this would be close to where the Dead Sea is, or the Red Sea rather, and that area, right, which is rather large, is what we're talking about, right? That general area. The Nile's not over there. It's not it goes like, I've been to the source of the Nile, right? Like it's in Uganda, and it goes all the way up through Egypt, but it does not really go through Iraq, right? And so it's really interesting that a lot of people are like, well, it seems like it might be the Nile, but I'm personally like, how could it possibly be the Nile? Like that's going in the opposite direction. It doesn't go through that area, but it could be that perhaps,
I feel like people want to connect the Nile just because it's such a dominant river. Like they're looking for a reason to connect it, because there's so much history that happens with Egypt. They're like, one of these rivers has to be the Nile.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's the more intelligent claim that I just don't know about, but maybe it's even that that it would have split off and maybe joined with what's today called the Nile. Like, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know how that works, because rivers oftentimes connect with each other and go out or whatever. Stuff changes again with as the ground changes, right? So I don't know, but that's one of the popular theories, is that it's frequently identified as being the Nile. Gahan is, anyways. Some people think that Bashan might actually be the Indus River, right, or going into India. Now, either way, Ganges goes into India too. So either way, people seem to think that it would be one of the ones that goes towards India in that direction. But what I thought was an interesting take, and I'll read this quote. This is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. I had never heard this take before reading it here. But it says, if the original author, and this is of Genesis, was in an area close to the Persian Gulf that was being watered by the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the branching of the river might well have referred to the upstream bifurcation of the rivers. Bifurcation meaning it's split in two, right? For anyone who doesn't know, since from Genesis 2:6, it appears that a river overflowed in the garden to provide irrigation, because the kind of point that it makes in that passage is that everything was watered by these rivers. So it's pointing out, hey, this is some type of irrigation. It says it is probable that the inhabitants of Eden were living in an irrigation culture, which is an interesting little claim there. So not specifically just within the garden, but even outside of the garden, like in Eden in general, even when they're outside of it, that it's kind of managed as this irrigation culture. It says, thus, it is very likely that Bashan and Gahan were the names not of rivers as commonly understood, but of major irrigation canals. And I was like, that's an interesting thought. It says, which because of their nature have disappeared over the millennia. The narrative makes it clear that the author regarded these two waterways as equally renowned in his day as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that he was also describing an actual geographical location in rather primitive terminology. The location of the garden could thus be placed with considerable assurance in ancient Sumer. So I thought that was a really interesting take, that perhaps it wasn't strictly that these were natural rivers, right? But that the first two were really these man-made, or maybe not strictly man-made, irrigation canals. I was like, that's a very interesting thought. And then of course it would naturally go away over time because it's not as deep cut. So I don't know. Like, if someone was asking me like, well, where do you land? I'm like, I don't land yet. Like, I'm just not sure,
My only
but-
issue with that possible theory would just be the fact that if God was creating the Garden of Eden, why would there have to be like man-made aspects to it later on? Like, I like the idea behind the theory, but I almost feel like God would have just been like, here's the setup. Like, there wouldn't have been like a need for there to be man-made canals. You know what I mean?
Well, that's why I also was saying like, because it doesn't say man-made. And that's why I said like maybe man-made, maybe not. Like he planted a garden. Maybe he dug a canal. Like, you know, like I don't know. Or perhaps is the way that it's trying to tell the story because it's clearly backing up and giving context and then going back into the story. I think part of the scholarly argument is that the backing up and the coming back into it is, oh, by the way, here's the context. This is where I'm talking about. And then it goes back into it. Meaning that perhaps at the time of the garden itself, maybe the garden itself didn't have those irrigation. That irrigation came later. But I don't know. You know, it's an interesting argument either way. But regardless, the general area, whether it's more ancient Sumer or more up towards Armenia, it's that general area. It's somewhere near there. Seems to be where Eden would have been.
I will throw this in here, though, as a possibility with that theory, though, that if the intention was basically that, you know, here's the land, you're going to work it. Like, that's going to be man's job. So after there being, like you were kind of saying, there was like this mist that kind of like fed everything. Once it was like, all right, here's your chance to take care of this. After that, he was like, all right, you know, maybe it was Adam that may have built these possible canal systems. And then that's what gets used later on because it was a matter of like, almost like we've talked about on previous episodes, like a father doesn't necessarily do everything for their son. They kind of say like, here's the basics. Now you figure out the rest from here because I want to see if you're able to do it. So that may have been where that context comes in, that the man-made canals where God built everything, but he was like, all right, let's see if you can figure out what I need you to do here. Almost like a test.
Yeah, maybe so. Right? I mean, like who knows when it says that he gave it to Adam to work the garden. And maybe you could make an argument that was part of working the garden.
Yeah, you had to give him actual work to be able to do. If everything's automatically just takes care of itself and God made everything perfect, then, I mean, you know, he has to create some type of work for Adam to do to be able to keep busy, because that's kind of the weird thing is that if God made everything perfect, it's like, what are the idle hands going to do? It's like you have to create work to be able to keep people busy so that they have something to do.
Well, I think that's interesting, right? Is that, you know, we think of work as bad, but it's like there was work before the fall. Work isn't necessarily bad. There is a curse after the fall where it says work now will become more difficult. But work was always part of the plan. Like there's nothing like, oh man, like when you're getting into it, like anyone who likes gardening, like knows what I'm talking about. Like when you get into it, it is so satisfying. It's so fun. Like it's like fulfilling. It's not like this, you know. Now if you're a farmer, yeah, it can kind of feel like it, right? Because it's a job. But having connection to plants and animals and the outdoors, it's like, it's so nice. It's so refreshing. Like I'm sure that Adam was not at all burdened. He was like, this is awesome. You know,
dude, I'll spend 6 hours every single Monday taking care of all my plants and my tanks behind me with like my aquariums and everything. And that's like the fastest 6 hours of work I'll ever spend on anything, man. It feels like it's like an hour because it's like, again, working the land, working with animals, working with plants. It's like, it's enjoyable as a human, you know, it's like part of our nature.
We're made to. Yeah. And that's what's really cool. It's neat. You know, if we're to hit, I have 5 points here about what the Garden of Eden was. And one of these points I think is cool to sit on, that so God planted it, but then it was worked by Adam. And when he made the Garden of Eden, he was designing it as a place clearly to work with Adam on something. It was like a father-son project, you know? He was like excited to set things up, but he plants the garden first, you know, makes Adam and then brings him in. He's like, hey, look, like I made this garden for us. Now we can work on this together. You know, it's this really cool, intimate thing. And to me, that explains part of why it's, you know, in chapter 1, it talks about when he, you know, creates the vegetation, creates the trees and the plants. And it says it was good. And I remember meditating on this like a year or two ago. And I was like, what is so great about trees that God made trees and was like, this is good. Like he said the same thing about stars and the universe and creation of humanity. And then he's like, he made trees, you know, and you're like, how are trees like, he's just like, oh, this is awesome.
Isn't it weird how that's naturally in you though? That it's just like you see these certain landscapes and you're just like, yep, this is good. And it's just as like a human, you can literally go into the woods and just see like a grouping of 5 trees and you just have that feeling in your heart like, yeah, this is good.
And you're like, why is it good? And it's like, well, because it came from God and God is good. But also, I think that there was something more to it. Like when God made those trees and those plants, we now know why. Reading in chapter 2. Like he made these plants, not just for the, survival of the planet in general, but like he then intentionally planted a garden. Like he invented trees and plants so that he could not only cultivate a garden, but cultivate a relationship with humanity.
Want to hear something really, really crazy to think about too? Almost in a weird way, giving people the same feeling that he gets, that of almost like creating like him in a way, if you really think about it, because, you're taking the seed, you're putting it in the soil and it ends up creating this plant. So it's almost like the closest that he could give mankind to having the same type of creation feeling that he gets, because the same feeling that you get when you grow a plant from a seed is the same kind of feeling you get when you have a child that's your own. It's this like creating life on your own feeling. Like it's the closest you can get to like, again, being with God, but he tries to give you that exact feeling that he gets. So it's just like a weird perspective of thinking about it, that he's basically trying to give you the same feeling that he gives by creating the universe that you live in.
Yeah, because we're created in his image and in his likeness. And so he wants us to experience aspects of the divine, which is to create. Like the first thing we're introduced to God as is a creator. And the first thing that humans are told to do is create. And I think that's awesome. To anybody who enjoys any creative process whatsoever, that's a divine thing. That is actually hearkening back to the creation and origin of humanity in of itself, which is so cool and so poetic. And this is why I can never get enough of Genesis, because you sit and you meditate on these things and you're like, whoa, everything points back to this.
Talk about creating and manipulating the environment. Just like look at landscaping in general, like setting up a garden. Like that's literally like you're creating the environment in front of you. Like if you break it down in those contexts, like it's such like a crazy thing to think about.
Oh, seriously. Something I failed to mention earlier, with the word Eden, I forgot to say what it actually means, like the word Eden, right? There is debate on the meaning and the etymology of the word Eden. But what in general, it seems to be something like delight, paradise, or luxuries, or place of luxury. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Hebrew, when they translated it into the Greek, the way that they translated it was the garden of luxuries, which I think is really interesting. So the Jews seem to think that, understanding their language and understanding Greek, that translating into the word luxury made the most sense. And so it does seem to be this description of Eden being a place of luxuries. And this makes sense because not just in terms of, prolific plant life, but there's all these mentions of in this chapter about jewels of every kind and gold and all these amazing things, right? Later on, if you read more verses that are pointing back to Genesis 2, like in Ezekiel, it talks a lot about Eden, and there's all these mentions of the onyx stone and this and that, and there's all these beautiful jewels. There's every good, beautiful thing was in Eden. It was like, that's where all the cool stuff was, and then the idea was for humanity to kind of spread that throughout the world to make the rest of the world like what Eden was. And so that brings me back to those 5 points that I wanted to make of what was Eden. Eden was, one, a place where God, angels, humans, and animals all dwelled, which is cool to think that it wasn't just like, oh, this is where humanity was there and God was there, but like this was everybody. We know there were angels because, places like Ezekiel 28 open us up to, the devil was actually, before he fell, the devil was actually a good guy. He was actually an angel and he was hanging out in Eden. And it talks about that in Ezekiel 28, that he was there. It says on the holy mountain of God, he was there in Eden. And it says that he was blameless and was without transgressions, right? So before he fell, he was actually hanging out in Eden, and likely so were all the angels. Why? Because Eden was heaven. Like there wasn't a need to be somewhere else. It was heaven because that's where God dwelled, and wherever God dwelled was heaven, right? In a very true sense. And so God was there, angels are there, Humanity's there. The animals are there. Everybody's there. This was the party. This was the place to be.
This might be somewhat of a loaded question here, but just out of curiosity, because I was going to ask this a little bit earlier, but I'm glad you brought this back up because it might fit in context now. So talking about like the dwelling place of God, like Eden itself, when you hear other contexts about people like seeing God or experiencing God, you usually don't see so much of like people actually like being, quote, in the presence of God, like physically, but more so like in the presence of God. But you hear about like certain references, like somebody being able to see like his, like a certain aspects of his body, different like parts of him that he's able to like physically show to them. When it comes to Adam being in the garden, if God himself is dwelling in the garden, what's the context of Adam as far as like, is he able to like see God for like for himself? Is it just like a presence that he's feeling that he's around? Like, I don't know if anybody's really fully addressed this, but like, what's the like relationship in that way between like Adam and God? Like, is he actually seeing him in the garden?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think he is. And we get several clues to this. But part of it is in the next chapter, in chapter 3. So when Adam and Eve do sin, it mentions that they heard God's footsteps in the garden, so they hid. So he is physically walking around in a physical manifestation. So from what we can tell, this again before the fall, right? They were able to look him in the face, but as soon as they sin, they're actually hiding from him, and we don't know if they ever see his face again. Probably not, because later on we find out that if you see his face, you can't stay alive if you're a sinner. So beforehand, they probably did. They were probably looking him in the face. They probably knew what it was like. They saw him, and even him in the face, like, what does it even mean, right? Like, I don't know, because he is beyond form, but he chose to take one. He chose to take a form, to become interactable, to become personable, to become, have the ability to have this intimate relationship with Adam and Eve and the rest of humanity, right? So I think there was very much a physical aspect of the presence of God.
See, and this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, that our idea of physical might be different of what the idea of physical might be in the garden. Kind of like a weird thing to think about, but like getting into, again, like the gowns, for example, that are mentioned that they wear in the garden, being these like energy gowns and things. Like what we perceive as like the Garden of Eden may not be what, in the same physical sense that like we're imagining, if that makes sense how I'm trying to explain it. Like they're being able to see God maybe because they aren't in the physical reality that like we're perceiving right now. They may be in this more like heavenly or like energetic type bodily form, and they're not as physical, so they are able to interpret God himself. But after the fall and they get kicked out of the garden, maybe they take on more of like a different physical presence.
I think what you have to do is just be like, to have any idea of what we're talking about, we just have to be clear with our definitions, right? And if you want to say something that's physical is something that can interact with something physical, like hearing a footstep, right? Then it's physical, right? I think that a lot of people think about spiritual and they think that by definition it means not physical. I don't think that's accurate at all, because spiritual things interact with physical things all the time. In scripture, there's, angels slaps Peter at one point. I mean, like they're very physical, right? And they do physical things pretty frequently. They're walking around a lot. When we see angels just walking, like, why are you walking? Can't you fly? I mean, what are you doing? There's so many questions, but there's way more physicality to it. What material they're made of is its own discussion. But like whether or not that thing can physically interact with physical things, that much is clear that the answer is yes. But it's very interesting. And you mentioned the whole, like, gowns of light. And there's a lot of speculation around that. Like scripture doesn't mention that, right? But that's been one of the guesses, is that, well, we see Moses when he's with God in his presence, he starts glowing. So like, well, I wonder if, and that's where a lot of that comes from. I wonder if Adam and Eve were glowing because they were with God's presence, so that they were glowing so much that they didn't need clothes, but then they sinned, they lost their glory. And now, but regardless, humans were already made to be hybrid. We were already made to be both spiritual and physical in nature. And so for sure, I think there was something unique. For sure, there was something special there. But exactly what all those details look like, it's one of those fun questions we're just left to go, I don't know.
See, and that might fall into the whole aspect about why it's hard to find the location, is because if you're, again, kind of a hard thing to explain, but if you're looking for this place that's physical, but it's existing more in like a spiritual aspect of the word, so to speak, then it's like, you know, you may be in the location, but you may not be like interpreting the location because you're not like viewing that area properly. Like, I know it sounds kind of weird and a little like woo woo, but like, yeah, if you're not like in that spiritual, I don't want to say spiritual plane, but like if you're not interpreting it from that spiritual perspective, then you're not actually like seeing it.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many questions that come with that in terms of, you know, once the fall happens, right? And it says, you know, from then on, it's guarded with these cherubs, these cherubim, right? Big, scary spiritual beings. You know, they were not just a mirage. They're these like things that would fight you if you tried to go into the garden, right? And so there's so many questions there, right? Here's a spiritual being, but it's a physical protection, and it's protecting a physical garden, you know? And the thing that was so important was like, well, this was physical, but again, it was a meeting of two realms, if you will, right? The spiritual realm and the physical. And so this was the place of God. And so humans were just not allowed back in yet because, well, they were sinners. And if they were to go back in, they'd have to die in order to be allowed in there, just like with heaven, right? So it was the same thing. Why? Because it was heaven. Like that's where God was, you know, it's like the same rules apply. And, you know, an interesting question that you can ask is, did God remain in the Garden of Eden until the flood? It's a really interesting thought exercise of like, well, hold on. Like, were the cherubim there the whole time until the flood happened? Like, was that where people went when they died? Did they go to the garden? Like, how does that work? What does that look like? You know, like, it's interesting. I mean, there are claims now, not in the Bible, but like Jubilees 4:23 through 25 makes a claim that that Enoch, when he was taken up, right? And people would know and say, oh yeah, he went up to heaven, right? Jubilees claims that he went into Eden, that when God called him out and pulled him out of, you know, the land, that he was actually like pulling him into Eden. And then he spent time with God in Eden. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But that could be true if God was sticking around in Eden and wasn't necessarily going upstairs yet, you know? And it's kind of a fun and really interesting thought that perhaps heaven was still on earth, but in a guarded garden where these scary cherubim and this flaming sword was never going to allow a human to enter. And then to think, like, if it's true, then to think the crazy, both irony and just poetic nature of imagine the world getting so horrifically violent and evil, and the whole world is getting to this place of evilness, right? To the extent that God has to destroy the world while he's in the midst of it the entire time, while he's in the middle in his guarded little garden, right? In this small, I mean, who knows how big it was, but in this paradise, right? Surrounded by like the face of evil humanity all around. That would be wild if that's the case. And I have no idea. It just doesn't tell us, right? But what an interesting thought that that's technically a possibility, is a really interesting thought, at least to me. And you know, I don't know. I feel like there's a decent chance. I think it's possible that might be something that's going on there.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to that deep conversation you crave. If you're looking at it from that perspective, if you were, so where would the map fall with this as far as like where they started building the temples? Would that mean that he was like in Eden and he would basically just appear at the temples if you're looking at it from that context?
Well, there weren't temples yet.
Okay, so after after that was destroyed, then the temples would have showed up. So, okay, that's where I was trying to fit where the context of like the first temple and where this like Eden story would have fallen in.
Yeah. So because you have Eden, there are no temples. Then you get to the flood. Then after that, you have Tower of Babel. And by that point, it's already clear that it mentions God having to come down from heaven to see the Tower of Babel, right? Well, not to see it. That's the wrong word, but to come down and visit. And then he, you know, splits up the nations. And it's after that he then grabs Abraham and says, all right, I'm going to start a people through you. And then they start getting temples and well, tabernacle and temple and altars and all that stuff. So it's afterwards. So yeah, I don't know. So it's possible. But back to those 5 points. So the first one is a place where God, angels, humans, and animals all dwelled. Genesis 2-3 and Ezekiel 28. 2, it was a pleasing place of plenty, right? It was that kind of picturesque paradise. It had all of those things that you would think that, paradise would have. And then 3, it was planted by God, which is part of what made it unique, right? It was specifically planted by him. And then it was worked by Adam, Genesis 2:15. And then 5th one, and this is an interesting one, it was potentially on a mountain. There's a little bit of debate here, but I think there's pretty dang good chances that this is the case, for a couple of reasons. Ezekiel 28:14, after it talks about the devil being in the Garden of Eden, at first when he's fine, it also then says you were in Eden, blah, blah, blah. And then it says you were on, God's holy mountain. And so some people are like, well, maybe that was a different mountain, a different place. I lean towards, I think it was probably Eden. And one of the reasons I think that is the parallelism structure could make sense there. And also the fact that all of these rivers are pouring out of this one place. At the very least, it's an elevated area, but it would make a lot of sense for it to be a mountain. But also think about all the other places where God has met humanity. There were almost always mountains.
I mean,
right?
that's universal across almost every belief
religion.
System too. Is that everything comes up from the mountains? Even getting into the Greek stuff, they talk about the rivers flowing down from the mountains of the gods. This is a reoccurring concept through everything.
Yes. Everybody knew if you wanted to meet with a god, you'd go up, you climb up a mountain, or you'd build a ziggurat, which is what? An artificial mountain, right? It's like, if you don't have one, build one kind of thing, right? So Mount Sinai, right? Mount Zion, these were holy places where God met and dwelled with humanity, where he ended up having, temples or with Sinai just quite literally manifesting and talking with Moses and doing all those amazing, crazy things that he does there, right? Another thought is, and this I think is kind of cool. So in Exodus 20, verse 24, when God tells his people, hey, here's how to make altars, he explicitly says to make their altars from earth, just earth. He says, so they're making a mound basically of earth. And they would perform the sacrifice on that dirt. And there's so much symbolism there because one, if Eden was a mountain, then think of the mound, right? And then the sacrificed animal, which the first sacrifice ever was in Eden, right? We see in Eden after they sin, it then mentions that God puts animal skins on them. That is the first mentioning of animals dying ever, right? And it's to cover them. And the word that's there is the same word of covering as to atone, right? And so there's so much symbolism there that, we're very confident that was a sacrifice, that he killed them to the animals in order to atone for their sins so that Adam and Eve didn't have to die right away, right? So he atones for them. And then he then says, I have to send you out, right? He sends them out, but he clothes them in the animal skin. So when you're performing a sacrifice and you're building this mound out of just earth, well, what was humanity made out of, right? The dirt, right? And then you're making this mound, thinking of the holy mountain, right? And then you kill an animal and then you lay it on there, right? And there's fire, which symbolizes the purification. And whenever we read about heaven, we always see fire. There's fire in God's eyes, right? So there's this holy symbolism. There's purification symbolism. It's making you think of humanity itself, of Eden, of what happened in Eden, and the first sin. It all goes back to Eden in terms of the sins, right? In terms of the first animal sacrifice. So all of these things, all these different ways of looking at this sacrificial system was all pointing back to Adam and Eve in the garden, and that first sin, that first sacrifice, which would be so heavy in such a good way in that moment, right? Of realizing I am connected to humanity in the same painful way that, my ancestors were, right? And it all goes back to the Garden of Eden. So I just thought that was really neat. There's so much symbolism that's layered on top of layer on top of layer. When it comes to how God described what sacrifice should look like. And I think it's because he's the king of symbolism, right? That he puts all that stuff together. So I thought that was really neat. That to me really stands out because there's something about nature in general that I think should always be calling us back to that thought, always be calling us back to the original garden and that perfect creation. Everything good that we see is just like a glimpse of what it would have been like. And I can only imagine. But when we look in that garden, we see like what things were like before they fell. Like it would have been wild and spectacular. I mean, there's talking animals, and they don't bat an eye, right? So who knows? Like, were all the animals talking? Like, I don't know. And then to think that, they were all speaking the same language. Like, was it angels spoke the same languages as humans and God and animals? Was there one language period for all beings and creatures? Like, I don't know.
See, this is something I think we brought up at one point. We were talking about the Tower of Babel, that we've even kind of thrown in the possible theory that maybe everybody had the ability to communicate telepathically, and then it became a physical language after the Tower of Babel. But if you're looking at it from that context, being able to communicate with animals would totally make sense through that context, that they're not actually like moving their mouth to talk, but rather that you're just interpreting what they're thinking or saying towards you.
But it could be that they're talking because Balaam's donkey. That happens later, right? So it's like, who knows, right? There's so many cool possibilities here. And that's part of what makes it fun, right? There are so many opportunities. There are also so many possibilities. Is it all the above? Like, I don't know, right? There are a lot of Jewish writings that claim that it was Hebrew, but it's also a pretty biased group of writings. so I don't know. But there's an interesting thought that perhaps, I don't think that it's true, but it's kind of a fun thought, that perhaps they spoke some original older version of Aramaic. And I think it's kind of interesting. So whoever's listening, fun fact that you might actually not know, like I'm sure you've heard of Eden in general, but something you might not have heard of is the people of Eden. There's this phrase that shows up in the Bible, in 2 Kings 19 verse 12 and in Isaiah 37 verse 12. It's kind of funny. It's verse 12 in both cases. There
might be some symbolism there. Maybe, who knows?
I don't know. But it mentions the people of Eden, and you're like, what? Because this is way after the fall. It's way after the floods, way after all that stuff. Well, it turns out there was this Assyrian emissary who is talking to God's people, and he says in his own language this expression that is translated the people of Eden. And I can't pronounce it right, but I'll try. It's something like Maru Adini. And I'm reading a little clip, and I'm trying to kind of paraphrase it for you guys. But I'll have this cited. This is from another scholarly work, specifically again from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. It goes into depth on this. You should really read the article, but here's just part of it, right? It says, in Akkadian text, this phrase is reserved for the members of Bit Adini, a branch of our Armenian tribe. And so the Arameans, this is where we get Aramaic, right? And it goes on to talk about an argument for why, based on all these different details, they believe that it was probably referring to the specific group of Armenians, close-ish to where modern-day Armenia is, and that area still being referred to as Eden in that day. So it's possible that larger region was still known as Eden, even though it was long after all those things were over, and that those were the Aramaic people, or referred to as people of Eden. And if that's the case, I mean, that would be interesting. Right? There's some fun thoughts there. If there's a connection there to the Armenians and now the modern day Armenians, and the Aramaic language as well. Like, Aramaic is the language that part of the Bible is written in, and it's the language that Jesus spoke. And maybe that's completely coincidental, right? But I think it's kind of interesting that, in the area where Eden likely was, the people that were referred to as the people of Eden, you know, spoke the same language as Jesus ended up speaking. I think is just kind of a fun fact, even if it doesn't end up meaning anything significant. But you know, there's cool little Easter eggs there where it's like, huh, that's like, that connects. I have no idea if that means something, but that's kind of a fun little fact, you know, like there are these people of Eden, and it was the people who spoke Aramaic, and that, you know, that's the language that, you know, that Jesus spoke in his day, right? And that's in that language that he says, like, you know, it is finished. It's in that language that he says all those famous phrases on the cross. It's kind of cool to think that maybe there's perhaps some connection. Now, you know, do I really think that they spoke Aramaic in Eden? Like, probably not. Like in the Garden of Eden, like probably not, right? Like the people of Eden that are mentioned in that passage, they came way after the flood, right? Like, and that language, you know, it's so hard to know based on the way languages change at the Tower of Babel. Like, who knows, right? But who knows? Maybe there is a little bit of, you know, some root connection to whatever that original language was. I mean, there's very close relationship to most, you know, Semitic, you know, ancient Near Eastern languages. So there's a possibility that, you know, it might be somewhat closer to whatever that original language was. But it was just a fun little, you know, factoid that I ran into that I was like, huh, that's a fun little thing that I feel like most people haven't looked into or didn't know about.
Just to throw in some possible, maybe some context, maybe that could possibly prove where the location theoretically was, because if the garden was eventually destroyed, assumably there's going to be some like remnants left over from the garden. And if there's remnants left over from the garden, when people come in, if there's stuff left over from language, things like that, they might start picking up on that language. So, you know, maybe that whole context might be proof of where the location might be just because of the people that came in afterwards and kind of picked up what was maybe left over there.
Yeah, and I don't know, like, where the written things, like, beats me, but in general, if there's just that general feeling that people refer to that area as Eden, and the people who live there as, oh, there's the people of Eden, then yeah, maybe there was some older oral tradition or knowledge that was kind of lost to time, but that those people still knew about, and they were like, yeah, that's where Eden was, you know. I don't know, but it's a possibility, and it's a fun one, right? Because it doesn't give us like an exact location. Like, that's still a very large area. But yeah, it's honestly at the end of the day, the cool thing is that there's still a bit of mystery to it. And I kind of like that way, to be honest, right? Because it's already this cool, mysterious place that even if we knew where it was, let's be real, there'd still be so many questions, right?
It's kind of like Atlantis too, that it's like as more time goes on, the harder it is to actually try to find this location. So it just adds more into like the mystery of it, and almost kind of like makes the story bigger and bigger as time goes on, because it becomes harder and harder as time goes on to actually find the location.
Well, and how would you even know you found it anymore? Because part of what made Eden was presence of God and all these spiritual beings and crazy stuff. But it's like, well, the special trees aren't there, right? God's not there. Angels aren't there, so it's like you could find it and have no idea.
Not to relate Eden constantly to Atlantis, but honestly, same thing with Atlantis. Some of like the clues to finding that are like the miniature elephants and like these little things. And it's like, even if you find it now, it's like there's so many people that are hard set, like, yep, this is the location. But half the clues that you use to find the location, it's like you can't actually find any like solid evidential proof of. Like, you're only strictly going off of like geographical locations. And as we see, like maps and things change over time, and so do interpretations. So it's like, it's one of those things that even if like you found the location, you had proof in your mind that you found the location, there's still going to be thousands of people that come out of the woodwork that have other facts on why they prove that it's not the location, because it's going to be one of those things that it's just always going to live in obscurity just because of the age of information that we live in nowadays.
Yeah, and because of just the nature of the beast, which is, you know, a lot of people just would rather be the person who got it right. So even if you got it right, you know, they'd like rather it be something else. You know, humans are just funny that way. So it's like you can have the answer the whole time. Dude, doesn't mean people will accept it.
Talking about the whole thing with like Sodom and Gomorrah and that supposed like salt pillar that they believe might actually have been Lot's wife. I mean, even if they cracked that thing open and actually found human remains inside, you know, there's still going to be people that deny that that's the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah,
right. And I have no idea. I mean, I'm curious about that solid structure, right? Like, I would think that it'd be gone by now, but I don't know. Who knows? Like, there's plenty of other stuff that shows that it's the general site of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And so we have all this destruction and stuff we found underneath the ground, but it's like no, that can't be. They can't be, because why? Well, because it's evidence for the Bible, so so it can't be right. But,
you know what people need to understand, though, is regardless of like context, regardless of what you believe with the Bible, like clearly these are huge historical events that you see reoccur through multiple different like religions, viewpoints. So as a scientist, at a certain point, you have to go, all right, even if this is in maybe not in a context that I fully believe, like this is something that's reoccurred so many different times, there's got to be a grain of truth to it. So it annoys me sometimes that people will strictly deny something because it's in the Bible when you see just points and points and points of truth that lead to this specific thing. Like time and time again, regardless of what you believe as far as the Bible goes, to any of the listeners out there are things that have been proven as fact, but people still want to avoid them because of the context of it. Like, again, even with the whole Jesus thing, regardless of what you believe or who you believe Jesus was, like there is more than enough documented proof that Jesus was a real person. Actually, more documented proof than Julius Caesar, for example. But again, people still want to deny it just strictly because of the biblical context of it.
Yeah, and that's a good call out, right? Because there are tons of religions I don't agree with, but if they claim something historical and I see their evidence for it, I'm not going to be like, no, I disagree because I don't believe what you believe. That's just terrible history. That's terrible science. That's not how we do things. So yeah,
like people denying the whole flood narrative, even though you see that everywhere. It's like, regardless of what you believe, there was some giant flood narrative or something, that cataclysm that happened. So it's like, what, you're just going to throw that out with the bathwater strictly because it comes from a religious viewpoint? Like, no, there's clearly something to it. And you need to remember the fact that everybody from these ancient times was coming from a religious viewpoint. So no matter what religious viewpoint they were coming from, they're going to be writing these events under that viewpoint.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's like, hey, just treat the evidence as evidence. Treat it as anything else, right? Like, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's true, it's true.
Yeah, if it's reoccurring and you see it constantly reoccurring, like, stop throwing it out with the bathwater.
If you see corroboration, there's probably something going on there, right? If you see, evidence across space and time, hey, there's pretty good credibility there, But in general, like, the Bible has been proven to be historically accurate time and time again after so many years of people trying to somehow prove it historically inaccurate. Then we always end up finding out that it is. So it's like, at some point, you got to admit something's historically accurate. And because so many historically accurate things are pointing to the same book, it's like you eventually have to admit that, it's a pretty historically accurate book.
Not to mention if thousands and thousands and thousands of people were willing to die for this thing over time, like there's clearly got to be something extremely important within the context of that. And even from a scientific perspective, you have to view it that way.
And I understand that, like, you can easily say, well, people can die for all sorts of reasons, right and wrong, smart and stupid, right? And that's true. But that's not like, we don't base everything off of, well, people have died, so it must be true. It's like, well, no. But the fact that people are dying for it shows that they believe something full.
There's a level of importance to it. So you need to take that in consideration.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, it just tells us that they believed it fully, right? And so, man, if this many people believe it fully, well, then maybe I should check it out. But I'm like, hey, like, people die for Islam. People die for tons of religions. But it's like, okay, well, what is it that you're dying for? What is it that, that you believe so strongly? And then you look at the evidence like anything else. It does not have to be this like blind, faith thing where it's like, well, I'm just going to hope that I'm right. It's like, no, you can look it out. You can, look it up. You can search it out. You can dig in and you can figure out what's really true about it. The truth doesn't care whether or not you.
Dude, prime example of this is there's a lot of like creationist scientists that are trying to go against this whole idea about like how long it takes for stalagmites to form inside of like caves, for example, and how long like the fossilization process takes to happen. And they've actually like somewhat proven that this can happen in a shorter period of time than like what science has actually proven. But strictly because it's coming from the creationist perspective, they're like, nope, must be completely false. It's like, no, there's clearly something to this, but you're denying it because of the viewpoint. the true scientific perspective would be to say, all right, let's look at this context. And when you start looking at that context, maybe you can start working it back. But that's the problem is I feel like once they find something, they're going to have to start working it back. So once they open that door, they don't want to. So it's like, deny all of it.
Yeah. I was just recently talking to a physicist and mathematician who was giving me some insight into just how intense some of that academic realm is and how there really is this tough stigma. It's like, if a Christian scientist says anything, it's just immediately discredited. And it's not that every single scientist views it as discredited, but that, they're kinder people, but that are, on a more official level, right? That it's like, sorry, like that's not going in our journal. Sorry, that's not, going to be accepted as legitimate. And it's all in the name of, well, it's, you're biased, so we can't have your thing. But isn't that a biased opinion? Isn't it biased for you to say that you can't include this because of something that person believes or whatever? At the end of the day, it should simply be: does the science? Are we observing it? Oh well, then I guess it's real.
There's a lot of really good scientists that get clocked up as pseudoscientists just because of their viewpoints. Like, regardless again of what you believe, the whole thing with Graham Hancock and the stuff that he's starting to prove with like the connections to like the floods and everything like that, everything gets ruled out as pseudoscience because of what he's digging into, even though he's coming at it from like a not strictly like one religious viewpoint, but he's still like proving things from all of these ancient religions. But because he's doing that, again, even though it's from a non-biased perspective, everything he's doing is getting viewed as pseudoscience by like the main, the main group of people that want to say, oh yeah, this is correct, this is not correct, this is factual, this is not factual.
Yeah, and he's a good example because he gets stuff wrong sometimes, but then he's like, oh hey, I got that wrong.
Which is how every scientist should be.
Yeah, so many people will point and be like, oh well, he got this wrong and that wrong. I'm like, yeah, he did. And like, I'm sorry, I forgot that you got everything right.
And part of science is that you're allowed to change your opinion with more information. So of course you're going to have one opinion, but with more information, you're going to change your opinion. And the problem is mainstream science doesn't want to do that, but then they want to scrutinize anybody that does do that, even though it's supposed to be part of the scientific method.
Yeah, that bothers me because I love science. I love history. I love just in general, like solid academic process and being logical about those things. And it drives me up the wall when people throw out the very thing they claim they believe in because they are against something else. I'm like, that's sad. Because I'm like, well, then you're not a scientist.
Yeah, you're just like, biased and no different.
I'm sure some people will be upset with me saying this, but at that point, you're a type of religious fanatic at that point because you have a belief system that is not based on the science that you're saying you're basing things off of, right? You're ignoring the thing that you claim you're following, but instead you have a belief system that you're choosing to blindly follow and to be upset at, raving at anyone who believes something otherwise. Like that, trying to convince me that's not a religious fanatic. Like this
was something that was happening during, the whole thing that was happening a couple of years ago that everybody was saying, just believe the science, just believe the science. And it's like, all right, well, at that point, isn't that kind of defeating like the whole purpose? Because once science becomes a belief base, then it kind of goes against what the imperial concept of it is in the first place. It's like, I have no problem believing the science, but I want the facts on why I should believe the science. But if you can't give me the facts on why I need to believe the science, then again, it's at that point almost becoming a religion, and like the faith aspect comes in, and that's again not what science is supposed to be.
I totally agree. There's a really good book called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," and it makes the whole case where it's like, I don't think that atheists realize how much faith it takes to believe that everything came from nothing. Like, that's a lot of faith. Like, or even just in general, evolution, or to be clear, evolution exists, right? But microevolution we observe, right? We test, we can reproduce, we see that, right? Macroevolution is the one that I have a problem with because it's never been observed.
It's like evolution versus adaptation. That's usually how I kind of define them a little bit better.
Sure.
But like adaptation is more so, I feel like things change in order to fit the environment, but they don't like fully change into a completely different animal over time.
Yeah, it's because there are genetic limits that we've found, right? There are limits where, we see in DNA things can mutate to a certain degree and then no further, right? And we've seen that for a long time. It's kind of funny because if I remember correctly, there were a couple of points that Darwin made where he said, if this turns out to not be true, my theory is trash. It just doesn't hold up.
The ironic part about him in the first place, though, that a lot of people don't get the back context of, was that he was an occultist and he actually had religious views, but yet he was trying to spout evolutionism. So it's like the fact that his whole theory was evolution went completely against his supposed views in the first place. And again, when you get into the whole weird aspect about him being like an occultist and everything, it's like, talk about misdirection. And then it's kind of a weird context that idea got pushed. And again, even looking into just the context of everything at the time with eugenics starting to become part of like this huge movement. And the whole idea of like when evolutionism got pushed and like the backing of the views of the people that were pushing it, it's a very contradictory concept.
Right. I mean, what's wild is that, Darwinism was the main is a strong word, but almost main, not method, tool that Hitler used. He was like, hey, based on Darwinism, like some races are better and some just aren't going to make the cut. And that was his claim. He was like, based on the science, and he just argued that Jews didn't make the cut. And so he killed everyone they found. I mean, that's wild, but that's where that ideology leans, right? It's like, if you've just decided that, it's like, well, survival of the fittest, and I've decided I'm the fittest. It's like, whoa, that's not cool, man. You can't just kill other people. But
that's just like most philosophies, though, is that somebody can clearly just make an observation and people can completely take that philosophy into something completely not what it's intended to be. And not that I'm trying to sit here and defend Darwin by any means, but simply just saying in nature, observing the fact that here's a weaker lion, here's a stronger lion. Which one's going to end up living? It's going to be that stronger lion, and that's just an observation. But people take that philosophy and turn it into something a lot different than what that simple observation was intended to be. And this happens a lot with philosophy, that somebody will strictly just say, this is what I observed. And people will take that into a whole different thing than what it was ever intended to be.
And the sad thing is, though, that it was immoral, but it wasn't illogical, right? Like the conclusions that he drew made sense. And that's why so many people were convinced.
Even in nature, I mean, you have within farming, for example, like you have a chicken, you have one that's weaker and not doing so well or starting to get sick. The other ones will attack that one. You'll see the same thing with fish, that if one fish has something wrong with it, like it ends up getting attacked, it has something wrong with its eye, the squirrel doesn't usually defend it most of the time. It'll end up attacking it to get rid of that weaker link. So it's again, a philosophy that you see in nature gets turned into something totally different when humans get their philosophy behind it.
Yeah. And also there's a lot of confusion there. Cause fittest tend to survive. Also, other things that are super weak randomly survive too, though. But then it's also but that doesn't necessarily mean that things mutate from one to the other. And, those claims are not the same thing. But honestly, I mean, I find, I'm sure a lot of Christians would be like, oh, how could you say this? But evolution's a cool idea. And macro evolution, it's very, there's almost a poetry to it. It's a neat idea. But as, scientific enthusiast, it's never been observed and it's just never been reproduced. So it's well, that's a cool idea. One, I mean, what I believe in, disagrees with that. But hey, if there was hard science that proved it turned out, hey, you know what, this really is a thing. I would examine that and I would take it for what it's worth.
Couldn't that also possibly mean that there might also be something that's tampering with it? And my example of saying this is, look at vegetation and what people have done to it. Our idea of an eggplant is completely different on what people had an idea of what an eggplant was 200 years ago. They called it an eggplant because it was this little round thing. And we've adapted and genetically altered it to now it's this big purple thing. So in a weird way, theoretically, if you were looking at it from that viewpoint, that humans are altering these things and causing them to have these little slight changes to them to fit the nature and everything a little bit better. If you're looking at this from a perspective of living things, couldn't you almost look at this it could also be God just kind of tweaking things just a little bit to make them work a little bit better. The same way, again, that humans would genetically modify like vegetation in order to make it just fit that niche just a little bit better. Like in a weird way, by like disproving it, you could also be proving it at the same time, right? Kind of a weird like 100%. catch-22.
Yeah, like absolutely.
Because then that would explain why you see it in some things but not others, is because it's like, all right, maybe I can go back and change that.
Yeah. But yeah, to wrap all that stuff up, it's like at the end of the day, you know, if we're going to do history, let's do history as historians. And if we're going to talk science, let's talk science as scientists, regardless of whether or not it's like fully your profession, just the basic scientific method. You know, like there are rules to these things, there are methodologies to these things. Let's stick to that and base things off of facts and not off of just what we want to be real or not. You know, at the end of the day, like let's just strive for that. Let's just try to do that. And maybe that can be the you know, word of wisdom answer for this episode, right? It's like, can we all please just take facts as facts and fiction as fiction, and you know, and treat things honestly. When something doesn't prove something, it doesn't prove it. When something is more of a probability than a certainty, it's a probability. We don't know, you know, but we can hold those things loosely and just be honest about it and then go on our merry way.
That's great. And I might have to throw this one in there, of course, too, that everybody needs to remember that you are allowed to change your opinion with more context and with more information. Everybody tends to forget that because we have this weird thing going on with society where it's like you scrutinize for people for changing or for changing their opinions. But on the other side, you also boost people up for evolving and changing over time. So it's like, when are we going to kind of figure out that balance of like when we're going to say that it's okay and when it's not okay? Because in my opinion, again, if somebody is completely blasphemous and then they get more information and they change into this totally different person, you're not going to scrutinize the old person that they were. So why is it different in an educational stance that, like, you know, if somebody was spatting that this is the opinion and then with more information they start changing it, why is it that you take their previous opinion to disprove their current opinion? Like, that's such a strange thing to me. Like, people are allowed to change their opinion with more information. Like, that's part of the context. That's part of life. That's part of changing as life goes on. So we need to stop scrutinizing people for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, to make it a Christian thing, just love people. Right? Yeah. No, I love it. That's good.
Hold on tight, guys. This is our last break, so stay tuned. And we are back to the show. So let's hop right in. So I guess before we start wrapping this one up completely, since we already hit the words of wisdom, of course, for a little bit of an Easter egg for possibly the next one, if everybody's been really enjoying this series and they possibly want a little sneak peek of what we might be talking about next time, do you have anything on the horizon about what we might be getting into?
Yeah, the thought is now that we've hit the basics of Eden and the Garden of Eden, that next up we can hit the future Eden, which is, you know, end time stuff, right? It's the new Jerusalem, it's the new heaven, new earth, what that looks like, how it mirrors Eden, and how it's different, because there's definitely huge differences. So, yeah, tune in next time for future Eden.
Always very exciting and always a very fascinating conversation when I have you on, man. I always really, really look forward to having you on and getting to have these conversations because I never quite know where they're going to go. I know we have a format, but it tends to be that we get into all of these different other realms of philosophy. And again, I just really appreciate you putting these together with me, coming onto the show and having these conversations with me. And it means a lot to me, man.
It's always a pleasure coming on, Shayn. Thanks for having me.
And before we wrap stuff up completely, man, if anybody wanted to be able to keep up to date on all of your work, they wanted to know all about Project Eleazar, where can people come and find you? Where can people come and find all of your work? And where can people even throw those biblical questions at you?
Yeah, so my website is projecteleazar.com. You can just Google it. You'll find it. That's where I've got my blog articles and postings for my, you know, the podcast that I go on, stuff like this. It's also where you can find contact information. You can reach out to my email, get connected to my social media. All the stuff can be found right on the website, projecteleazar.com.
Well, man, again, I appreciate it. And I'm assuming that we'll probably be hitting the next episode probably within the next month and a half or so. So to all the listeners out there, make sure you guys keep your eyes peeled for that. And we'll be hopping back into it with Future Eden.
Sounds good.
Big thank you to everyone for catching this week's episodes. Just a reminder, the show wouldn't be possible without listeners like you. Podcasts are a labor of love, and I want to be able to keep this show going for as long as possible. If you'd like to support the show and all the hard work behind it, some of the best ways that you guys can do that is through leaving a review or rating for the show anywhere that you guys happen to listen to the show. You guys can also share the show through word of mouth with anybody that you think might enjoy the show, because that's absolutely one of the best ways and only ways that podcasts like this can grow. And if you guys are in a position to support the show and find value in what I do, please consider donating to the show directly. That is absolutely the best way that you guys can support the show. You guys can do that through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, and any amount that you guys want. Any value that you find in the show, you guys can send back, and I would greatly appreciate. And of course, if you guys leave a note with that, I will read it on the show and give you guys a big shout out. And you guys can also go and check out the Patreon. That's just $2.50 a month, and over there you'll get full access to everything with that one single tier, such as video content, unreleased episodes, all that kind of fun stuff. And if you guys want to see what it's all about, there is a 7-day free trial available, so you guys can see what it's all about. And if you guys like it, hopefully you guys will stick around. And last but not least, you guys can go and check out the Bizarre Reality Media merch store with t-shirts just $15.68 plus shipping. I'm not really making anything off of those, so honestly, I just want to be able to see you guys wear and enjoy those shirts. So if any of you guys end up scooping anything off of that merch store, please consider sending me a picture of yourself wearing it so that I can post it on the pages, and of course give you a big shout out, because anything that you guys do support wise, again, I always appreciate. And if you guys want to keep up to date on the show, you guys can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. And if you guys are interested in catching live shows and video content, you guys can go and follow the Bizarre Reality Media TikTok, YouTube, and Rumble channels. And if you guys need another podcast to possibly get you guys through your work week, if you guys aren't already listening to my other show, please consider going and checking out Bizarre Encounters with Shayn Orin, diving into a lot of the same stuff that we talk about on this show, but in a different format, because it's us deep diving and doing our own research. There are some guests in the mix, but for the most part, it's us conversating back and forth about all the different weird stuff that we end up diving into and researching. And if you missed any of that, everything that I mentioned is all available on the link tree, which is available down in that show description. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with a mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries of Our Reality. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities,